Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the birth of a forgotten superpower. Picture a map of Europe in the late 1500s. To the west, Spain and France. To the south, the Ottomans. To the east, Muscovy on the rise. And then there's this enormous swath of territory stretching from the Baltic to the steppe, a federative state that many modern textbooks treat like a footnote. Let's change that. We begin in the year 1569 with the Union of Lublin. Think of two longtime partners, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, deciding that separate bank accounts and joint vacations are no longer enough. They merge their households. One parliament, one elected monarch, shared foreign policy and a combined strategic footprint that suddenly makes neighbors pay attention. Was this a conquest? No, it was a negotiated fusion, hammered out by nobles who understood that cooperation could multiply power faster than swords alone. Now, the political engine that made this fusion hum was something Europeans called golden liberty. It sounds like a marketing slogan, but it was a real constitutional culture. The nobility, known as the Szlachta, enjoyed extensive rights that were unusual for the time. They could elect the king rather than accept a hereditary dynasty. They sat in a parliament, the Sejm, that could check royal ambitions and shape taxation and law. Imagine a giant shareholders meeting where the stockholders are armed, educated, and passionately protective of their privileges. Was it messy? Certainly. But compared to the absolute monarchies surrounding it, the Commonwealth looked surprisingly participatory. Power didn't just flow downward from a single throne. It circulated across a wide network of regional diets, local courts, and noble assemblies. Of course, an ambitious state needs an economic backbone. Here's where geography pays dividends. The Commonwealth controlled the river systems and overland routes that fed the Baltic trade. Grain from its vast plains flowed northward along the Vistula, through the bustling port of Gdansk, and out to hungry Western European markets. In an age when bread was a daily political issue, being the breadbasket gave you leverage. Merchants, tolls, and warehouses turned into revenue. Revenue turned into influence. And influence, if you're careful, turns into stability. Notice the incentives at play. When your wealth depends on moving real goods efficiently across long distances, you start to value open routes, predictable rules, and the kind of legal order that keeps contracts and caravans safe. With political fusion and economic muscle came breathing room. And in that breathing room, culture flourished. Universities expanded, printing presses multiplied, and cities like Krakow, Vilnius, and Lviv grew into intellectual crossroads where Latin scholarship met Slavic literature and Jewish learning. Artists found patrons. Architects stitched Italianate styles onto local traditions. Even the map began to change, not only through military campaigns, but through settlement, chartered towns, and negotiated frontiers. When a state is confident, people build. When people build, ideas move. And when ideas move, a place becomes more than the sum of its provinces. So why should this matter to us today? Because the Commonwealth shows what happens when a society tries to balance broad political participation with the demands of great power competition. It demonstrates how shared rules can scale power across a continent-sized territory without a single iron fist. It also hints at a quieter truth. Economies are strongest when they can trade freely, tax predictably, and protect property well enough that farmers will risk planting more than they can eat. None of this is romantic. It is practical, and it explains why, for a time, this federative experiment stood shoulder to shoulder with Europe's mightiest states. Hold on to that picture. A negotiated union, a parliament with teeth, a grain empire tied to the Baltic, a cultural sphere buzzing with confidence. This is the Commonwealth at its rise. In the next chapter, we will test these strengths against the cold reality of contested borders and shifting alliances. But for now, let the map of 1569 linger in your mind. A forgotten superpower steps onto the stage, and the audience barely realizes the show has begun. The Commonwealth's early stability was impressive, but stability in this part of Europe is like trying to keep a candle lit in the middle of a windstorm. The northern and eastern frontiers were magnets for trouble, and the trouble came fast. Let's start with the Livonian War, running from 1558 to 1583. This was no minor border skirmish. It was a brutal, drawn-out contest with Russia for control of Livonia and its Baltic ports. Why did those ports matter so much? In an era before railroads, whoever controlled Baltic access controlled the economic lifeblood of the region. Grain, timber, furs, all moving through narrow maritime gateways. Ports weren't just harbors, they were toll booths for entire economies. Lose them, and your exports choke. Win them, and you hold the keys to both trade and security. Now, no war in this region was ever a simple two-player game. Enter the shifting alliances. Sweden, Muscovy, Denmark, and even the Holy Roman Empire found themselves woven into the conflict, each sniffing for advantage. The Baltic was Europe's multiplayer chessboard, and the pieces rarely stayed in the same color's hand for long. Allies one season could be rivals the next, and the Commonwealth had to navigate this shifting maze while keeping its own political coalition together at home. It was a test not only of military strength but of diplomatic agility. Yes, there were strategic gains. The Commonwealth did manage to secure some key ports, a vital prize in any Baltic contest. But the cost was steep: years of campaigning, vast expenditures, and a slow bleeding away of resources. Wars in the 16th century were not quick affairs. They dragged on through sieges, winters, and the grinding attrition of supply chains stretched thin. And then there's the part that military triumphs rarely show on the victory scroll: the strain. Financing these campaigns was always a delicate balancing act. The Commonwealth's military funding system leaned heavily on the nobility, who were not always eager to see their wealth turned into powder and shot. Without a centralized treasury flush with gold, the state had to negotiate, persuade, and sometimes beg for contributions. This meant that every prolonged war risked not only exhausting the treasury but also eroding the political goodwill that kept the federation glued together. The takeaway? The northern and eastern fronts were more than just lines on a map. They were pressure points, strategic prizes that brought prestige and opportunity, but also vulnerabilities that could drain a state's wealth and test its unity. In the Commonwealth's case, each gain came with an invisible price tag, and sooner or later, someone would have to pay it. If the North and East kept the Commonwealth on its toes, the South kept it awake at night. Here, the adversary was no regional rival but one of the most formidable powers of the era, the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans had been pressing northward, testing the frontiers of Christian Europe, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth sat directly in the path of that expansion. The rivalry was rooted in more than just geography. Control over Moldavia, Wallachia, and the Black Sea trade routes was like controlling the toll gates to a continent-spanning highway. Whoever held these territories could tax goods, influence local rulers, and project power deep into enemy territory. The Ottomans understood this. So did the Commonwealth, and neither side was willing to back down. One of the most decisive moments in this southern theatre came in 1621 at the Battle of Kotin. Picture tens of thousands of troops, the Commonwealth's forces bolstered by Cossack allies, holding a defensive line against the full weight of the Ottoman war machine. This wasn't just a fight for a fort, it was a fight to halt an advance that could have altered the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The victory at Kotin was hard-won. The Ottomans were stopped, and regional autonomy was preserved. It was a reminder that even against overwhelming odds, the Commonwealth could deliver a strategic punch. But victories on the battlefield rarely stand alone. Diplomacy was just as important as military might. The Commonwealth leaned on strategic alliances, particularly with Austria and other European powers, to counterbalance Ottoman influence. These weren't sentimental partnerships. They were calculated arrangements, the kind where each side watched the other as closely as they watched the enemy. In a world where borders could shift overnight, survival often depended on having the right friends, or at least the right temporary partners. Then there were the economic stakes, which were enormous. Control over Black Sea trade routes meant controlling the flow of goods that fueled the Commonwealth's grain export economy. Grain wasn't just food, it was currency, leverage, and the foundation of the state's wealth. If the Ottomans had secured the Black Sea choke points, they could have strangled that economic lifeline. Every military campaign and diplomatic negotiation in the south carried this unspoken truth: lose the Black Sea, and you risk losing the means to fund your defenses everywhere else. The southern frontier was, in many ways, a mirror to the Commonwealth's larger story, a blend of bold military stands, intricate diplomacy, and constant vigilance over the arteries of trade. It was a reminder that geography is destiny, and for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, destiny often meant standing in the way of giants. If the Ottoman threat tested the Commonwealth's resolve, the Swedish invasions nearly broke it. This period, remembered as the Deluge from 1655 to 1660, was not just another war, it was a catastrophe. Imagine a storm so violent it doesn't just damage the house but rips up the foundation, floods the cellar, and leaves you wondering if rebuilding is even possible. The timing could not have been worse. Internal unrest, Cossack uprisings, and political instability had already weakened the Commonwealth. Then Sweden, an ascendant Baltic power hungry for dominance, saw its chance. Their invasion was swift, coordinated, and devastating. Entire regions were overrun before defenders could properly mobilize. The destruction was staggering. We're talking massive population loss, towns and villages burned to the ground, and cultural treasures looted on a scale that would scar the nation's identity for generations. Priceless artifacts, manuscripts, and works of art, symbols of the Commonwealth's rich cultural life, were carted away or destroyed. And it wasn't just property. The psychological toll on the population was immense. People who had once lived under the relative stability of the Golden Liberty now faced a world where armies could march through their homes with impunity. One of the most profound losses was influence over the Baltic. Sweden emerged from this conflict as the dominant maritime power in the region, reshaping the balance of trade and naval clout. For a state whose economy relied heavily on moving goods through Baltic ports, this was not just a strategic setback, it was a blow to the very system that funded the Commonwealth's political and military operations. Control over those ports meant control over customs duties, tariffs, and ultimately, the lifeblood of state revenue. The enduring consequences were severe. The war left the treasury empty, the countryside in ruins, and central authority weakened. Rebuilding from such devastation was not simply a matter of repairing walls or restocking granaries. It meant trying to restore faith in a system that had failed to protect its people. Fiscal exhaustion meant the state had fewer resources to respond to the next crisis, and history, especially in Eastern Europe, rarely waits long before delivering the next one. The deluge wasn't just a chapter of military defeat, it was a turning point that exposed the fragility beneath the Commonwealth's grandeur. Even the most impressive political system can falter if its economic arteries are cut and its defensive shield is cracked. In the aftermath, the Commonwealth still stood, but it stood shakier, poorer, and with shadows lengthening over its future. By this point, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had weathered storms from every direction. But the truth is, some of the most dangerous threats weren't outside its borders, they were baked into its own political structure. At the heart of this was the liberum veto. It sounds noble, the idea that any member of the parliament, the Sejm, could end a session and nullify its decisions with a single objection. In theory, it protected minority voices and prevented tyranny. In practice, it was like giving every passenger on a ship the power to drop anchor whenever they felt uneasy. One dissenting voice, and national policy ground to a halt. And if you think that power wasn't ripe for abuse by foreign agents bribing or pressuring a single noble to block proceedings, think again. The decentralized nature of governance was another double-edged sword. The Commonwealth prized its system of regional autonomy and noble rights, which had once been a strength. But without a strong centralized executive to coordinate rapid decisions, mobilizing against threats became slow and politically messy. Imagine trying to rally a defense when every province wants to negotiate the terms separately, and every magnate has their own army to think about. In a world where centralized states like France or Russia could pivot quickly, this was a dangerous handicap. Layered on top of these structural issues was the constant warfare that drained resources year after year. Each conflict, whether against Sweden, the Ottomans, Muscovy, or internal rebels, demanded money, soldiers, and supplies. And because the Commonwealth's taxation system depended heavily on negotiation with the nobility, raising funds was never guaranteed. A crisis could be unfolding on the frontier while the Sejm argued over who should foot the bill. Comparatively, centralized states were beginning to pull ahead in administrative efficiency and military readiness. They could impose taxes directly, maintain standing armies, and respond to emergencies without months of political wrangling. The Commonwealth's freedoms, while admirable, were making it increasingly vulnerable in an age when speed and coordination were everything. This was the paradox at the core of the Commonwealth's identity. The very liberties that set it apart from its absolutist neighbors also hampered its ability to defend itself and adapt. And in geopolitics, weaknesses are never left alone for long. Other powers were watching and waiting for the moment when internal strain would open the door to external domination. By the 18th century, the cracks in the Commonwealth's foundation had widened into gaping fractures. Decades of constant warfare, political paralysis, and economic strain had worn down a state that had once rivaled the great powers of Europe. What followed was one of history's most sobering examples of how a nation can disappear from the map without a single decisive battle to mark its end. The cumulative effect of centuries of conflict was devastating. Armies had marched back and forth across the land so often that recovery between wars was never complete. Fields lay fallow, towns struggled to rebuild, and the population suffered repeated cycles of disruption. Economically, the Commonwealth lagged behind neighbors who were industrializing and modernizing their administrations. Without strong central institutions to implement reforms, inefficiency became entrenched. Militarily, the state was a shadow of its former self. The liberum veto and decentralized governance made quick mobilization nearly impossible, and even when troops were raised, they often lacked the funding, training, and equipment to match the professional armies of rivals like Prussia and Russia. The very idea of a standing army was viewed with suspicion by many nobles, who feared it could be used to undermine their freedoms. This political culture, once a source of pride, now left the Commonwealth unable to defend its sovereignty. And so the vultures began to circle. In 1772 came the first partition, a coordinated land grab by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The borders shrank, but the political system remained largely unreformed. The second partition in 1793 carved away even more territory, leaving the state crippled. By the time of the third partition in 1795, there was almost nothing left to defend. The map of Europe was redrawn, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ceased to exist as a political entity. No glorious last stand, no dramatic final siege, just the slow suffocation of a state unable to adapt to the modern age. What makes this story so striking is that the Commonwealth wasn't conquered in the traditional sense, it was dismantled. Foreign powers exploited internal weakness, bribed nobles, manipulated the liberum veto, and played the game of influence until the state could no longer function. It's a reminder that sovereignty can be lost not only through defeat in war but also through the erosion of the systems meant to protect it. The disappearance of the Commonwealth was a tragedy for its people and a cautionary tale for the world. A superpower, born from unity and sustained by liberty, had unraveled into a cautionary footnote in the ledgers of stronger, more centralized neighbors. And yet, its cultural and political legacy would continue to inspire generations long after its borders were erased. Now that we've seen its birth, its triumphs, and its collapse, it's time to step back and ask, what does this story really tell us? The Commonwealth's history is a balancing act between liberty and order. On one side, you had a political culture that gave unprecedented rights to the nobility, fostered debate, and resisted the heavy hand of central authority. On the other, you had the hard reality that survival in a competitive, often hostile world sometimes demands swift decisions, coordinated action, and the ability to enforce them. Lean too far toward liberty without enough order, and unity can unravel when the pressure is on. Its decentralization was both its glory and its downfall. The Golden Liberty system created an environment where different cultures, religions, and regions could coexist under one political umbrella, rare for its time. Yet the very mechanisms designed to prevent tyranny often prevented the state from protecting itself. The liberum veto, once a safeguard, became a tool of paralysis. The autonomy of regional magnates, once a strength, became a roadblock to reform. The Commonwealth also reminds us of the deep connection between economics and sovereignty. Its early prosperity came from controlling trade routes and grain exports, and as long as those arteries flowed freely, it could fund armies, diplomacy, and cultural growth. But once those trade advantages eroded, whether through war, competition, or shifting geopolitics, the state's ability to defend itself weakened. Wealth isn't just about comfort, it's the fuel that keeps a nation's defenses, alliances, and infrastructure running. Without it, even the proudest superpowers fade. And perhaps most importantly, this story challenges the way we think about power. The Commonwealth's fall wasn't a single dramatic defeat, it was the slow work of external rivals exploiting internal vulnerabilities. In a world where influence can be bought as easily as it can be fought for, sovereignty is as much about protecting the integrity of institutions as it is about defending borders. For modern audiences, there's a lesson here that transcends the particulars of Eastern European history. The strength of a state lies not only in its armies or its wealth, but in the resilience of its political and economic systems, and in the ability of its people to act decisively when survival is at stake. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of world history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History for more stories that connect the past to the present in surprising ways. And if you want to explore even more hidden narratives that history books often overlook, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking for the truths history leaves behind.